Millions of Americans across the country have been facing mounting rent and the possibility of eviction as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, there was a previous moratorium in place that had expired. However, President Joe Biden had extended that moratorium in a limited basis till about October 3rd, but only to places with high cases of COVID-19 and COVID-19 transmissibility. So now, of course, the entire point of the moratorium was to make sure that the $46 billion in federal rent assistance and aid reached the 11.4 million people who are currently behind on rent. So now what's the update to this? Well, apparently that money, a lot of it, most of it, has not reached the people who need it most. And so this is according to an analysis by Huffington Post. And so they report that much of the $46 billion allocated from the two different coronavirus relief bills have not been spent. So now this was released in two different tranches. One is $25 billion. And so of that, state and local governments have only spent about $5.1 billion on rental relief. So there's a lot of failure here. So we're going to look into what happened. Where did the money go? Why is it not going out? So for one, let's look at the obvious method of delivery, right? So the method of delivery that would be the most effective is to use a federal program. They did not go with that direction. They did not go in that direction to create a federal program or office or agency to disperse that money. Instead, we end up relying on state and local governments, a lot of them, of course, which are Republican controlled, to give out the funds. As you can see, this has been a complete and utter disaster. HuffPost found that roughly 60 areas had sent out $0 in federal rental assistance to the end of June. So now I mentioned Republicans, but in reality, this is a bipartisan problem. Because it turns out the states that did the worst were liberal states. In fact, you had New York, which was sitting on $801 million of rental relief, and the territory of Puerto Rico, which was afforded $325 million in relief funds to distribute, and they have distributed roughly nothing. Well, at least back in June. So now they're starting to disperse money, and I'll get to that. Now, some areas that had started their programs have also seen problems. See, even when they started those rent relief programs, turns out you had a lot of bureaucracy and a lot of paperwork getting in the way. As I mentioned, New York has dispersed about $186 million. Puerto Rico has dispersed nothing. And of course, again, that is an absolute failure. But once again, I also mentioned that they do not deserve all the blame. The federal government, I mean. The state governments do deserve a lot of blame. Because, again, if it had been federal, they would have set up a program. States have just dropped the ball. In a lot of states where the programs were up and running, applicants often faced confusing paperwork requirements and a lot of means testing. The Treasury Department, however, knows about this and has urged local governments to ditch excessive paperwork and take renters at their word that they are facing financial hardship. Instead of making, of course, gather documents such as court filings, pay stubs, and bank statements to prove that they are truly in need of this assistance. They said, and this is a department quote, "The use of self-attestation for documenting household eligibility clearly speeds up the processing of applications for rental assistance." But again, it's not just paperwork that's the problem. In some areas, they have not even begun the program. Jersey City, New Jersey, for example, didn't even open its application process until August 17th. So we have been facing this issue for quite some time, 8 months. Okay? The whole specter of the rentpocalypse, of these renters not being able to pay what they owe, okay? To pay their, to stay in their homes. We've known about this for a long time. And yet Jersey City is like, we're just going to sit there and fuck around for all this time. What are you doing? what are you doing? Now, the city, when asked, could not specify why it had taken so long to actually start that program. Gee, I wonder why. Maybe because they don't actually have a reason. All right. Now, there's another problem too. Okay, an even bigger problem than just the end of the moratorium that is coming soon on October 3rd. Turns out that there's a rule that if states don't use, or states and cities, that do not use 65% of their allocated funds by the end of September, the federal government can take the money back. On Wednesday, the Treasury Department said that programs that are unwilling or unable to deliver assistance quickly were at risk of losing their money, their funding. So you might want to get on it. Step on it. Now, interestingly enough, I mentioned New York, I mentioned New Jersey, or at least a city in New Jersey. There is one state that is actually doing a pretty good job of getting out this money, and it's not one that you would actually expect. This is not the first state that you would think is actually doing really good at dispersing federal aid. It's Texas. It's not New York, not Illinois, not big liberal states, but you have Texas. Now, I think there's an interesting reason for this, okay? More so than conservatives, I have noticed that liberals love to do excessive means testing. I know. And of course, with the increased means testing, there's a certain level of bureaucracy to go through. And let me give you an example. So one of the big differences between Trump's stimulus check and Joe Biden's, look, Biden's did give more money, $1,400. It wasn't a $2,000 that was promised, but it was bigger than the Trump $1,200 check. Now, there's a big difference, right? So Trump's check actually went to more people. So it was a little bit more universal, right? And there, of course, were still means tests on it, but the second check actually had more means tests on it, meaning, yes, it was more money, but it actually went out to fewer and fewer people. And so Biden's, as I said, much more targeted. And of course, when you target more, and this is the point, when you target more, it takes longer to get to the people who need it. Now, if you just send out checks to everybody, which is where the progressive position is, okay, and even some of the moderates, I remember Tim Ryan putting out a bill saying, let's just give everybody $2,000 and let's do it monthly. Well, if you do that, it gets to more people, it gets there faster, and it has a more immediate effect. And I think they could have actually done this when it came to the rental issue. Did a federal program, created a federal program to disperse the money and sent it universally. Or at least made it much less stringent for people to go and prove that they're in dire straits. And so now, of course, the immediate argument against that by a lot of people that are clutching pearls, oh, we don't want rich people to get money that they don't need. Okay, but for me, I think, who cares? Now, wait a minute. You're saying you want rich people to get free money? No, what I'm saying is that you disperse the money to everybody, and then you tax rich people back later. Or you generally just raise their taxes, and that's it. You ensure that they pay their fair share, and you also ensure by doing this universally that it doesn't get taken away. And two, you can then justify increased taxes on wealthy individuals to then pay for those programs. It's just more efficient. It works better. And again, taxing them back later it's just a better way to do things. The micro-targeting, the means testing BS, it just wastes time that we do not have. And if somebody gets money that they didn't actually need, well, again, there are enforcement mechanisms that you can come after them later in order to recoup that money. Stop putting hurdles into aid that is legitimately needed. And this, again, is a problem mainly we see from establishment liberals. Not progressives, but establishment liberals. That said, this doesn't mean I'm praising Donald Trump or conservatives. No, conservatives hate when poor people get money. And more often than not, when they do actually do help poor people, it's because that's a side effect of them helping the rich. So let's be fair about that. Let's not be confused about who wants to help who. Look, the main reason that the Trump administration had even sent out stimulus checks is because the donors demanded it. The donors understand during the COVID-19 lockdowns, the donors said, hey, people have to have money to buy our shit. Okay? So we give them a stimulus check so they can survive and buy our stuff. Whereas now, of course, conservatives are against more checks. They're against the moratorium, of course, because, well, their donors see no interest in giving poor people money now. They would rather send people back, send the kids back into school, masks or not, COVID or not, doesn't matter. You send the kids back to school so you can send the parents back to work so they can go make money for the capitalists and then consume. And that's what it's about. So understand the donors really are driving that conversation. Now on this, well, there are also donor interests involved. On the moratorium, you have real estate interests, real estate groups. And so, in fact, those real estate interests are still fighting against this moratorium, even as this money gets held up. Last Friday, a group of landlords had filed a request with Chief Justice John Roberts in order to block the temporary eviction ban. Earlier that day, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit left in place a previous court order that allowed the moratorium to continue. A ruling is expected on that, actually soon. News of the latest eviction moratorium just days after the previous one had expired was whiplash, according to Greg Brown, Senior Vice President of Government Affairs for the National Apartment Association, an industry group of property owners. So, it's whiplash for landlords. How dare you take away that eviction moratorium? Or I'm sorry, put it back into place after we got it taken away. Jesus. And see, understand this is why these two issues are so intertwined. Okay? Because we need the moratorium because the federal government and the states dropped the ball. They failed to get that money out at time to avoid the crisis. State governments and localities need to get their act together. Why? Because this is going to be more dire than just a few landlords not getting their money, or at least not getting their money in a timely manner. It's going to end up being a disaster. Once that emergency moratorium is lifted or struck down by the courts, whichever happens first, you're going to see a homelessness crisis unlike what we've ever seen before. And by the way, with all those people homeless, who do you think is going to go and occupy those homes and rent those homes once you've kicked people out? So either way, something has to give here. And more importantly, you've got to get that money out to the people who need it right away, as soon as you can, without any questions. Tick tock, tick tock. The clock is ticking, and they better get on it. They gotta get on it. If you enjoyed this video, please give us a like and share with your friends. You can subscribe and help out the channel by becoming a patron. It's patreon.com/Jeff Waldorf, or you can become a channel member as well by hitting the join button below.